shore here where opportunities were like shells to be picked up and claimed on a sandy beach. Living in a colonial settler society where what he did and how he did it was mostly seen as the rightful benefit of being an Englishman in the greatest empire ever seen. His family certainly loved and revered him. Those in power, both political and financial, tended to let him have his way because he was ill-tempered and talkative to the point of sermonizing, and often beyond that. It was simply easier to go with Firth's flow than to paddle against it in vain. Firth was a man of contrasts and absolutely deserves to have a full and comprehensive biographical study done about him someday. The following here is but a bare summary to fit in the time allowed for this presentation. I came upon his trail because of the book I wrote over the course of 2020 to this year. His name kept cropping up in a number of different aspects of Mongofo's history. I shouldn't have been surprised. Almost anywhere from the Piako area northward to the Bay of Islands in the last half of the 19th century would have had Firth's name pop up on a land deed, a commercial negotiation, or sometimes just simply in passing. I find his own works, such as Nation Making and Lions in the Way and Luck, to be valuable views into his mindset and his own motives in life. His books, of course, come first and earliest in any studies into Firth's nature and actions. Next, though, in 1963, his granddaughter, Mona Gordon, published her book about him. He was best known through Mona's eyes for most of the rest of the last century. She wrote very fondly of him and her grandmother and of Clifton, his castle home on the slopes of Mongofo. This book, though, was followed by an article published in 1969 in the New Zealand Journal of History on the Matamata estate, written by Matamata-born historian Duncan Bruce Waterson. He wrote, amongst other views, Firth's membership of the Direct Purchase Association of 1859 and his chicanery at the Cambridge hearings of the Native Land Court testify to Firth's overriding determination to destroy Māori land ownership and to reduce the tribes to acquiescent beggars on the fringes of the estate. In 1973, Mona Gordon produced another smaller book, this time on her grandmother, giving Firth's story from the viewpoint of Anne Clifton Firth's life, which is wonderful because there's not enough women's history written in terms of New Zealand history at all. So what she did was really wonderful to do that. But in exactly the same year, Russell Cyril James Stone published his classic Makers of Fortune, and Josiah Clifton Firth was definitely included. In Stone's work, we see a Firth constantly borrowing to refinance loans already held, as well as to maintain his Matamata estate and his flour mills. He gambled that his vast land holdings could be subdivided and sold off at a huge profit before the wolves came to his door. But he was gambling at the wrong point in New Zealand's history, at the edges and into the abyss of the Long Depression. Then came 1990's Dictionary of New Zealand biography entry by D.B. Waterson, in which he wrote, Firth's interests were not confined to business. He was an early conservationist, warning of the dangers of deforestation and soil erosion. His books are a curious amalgam of personal justification, social philosophy, religious homilies, autobiographical recollections, ethnographical observations, and traveller's tales. He resolutely attacked Darwin's theory of evolution as materialistic, became disillusioned with the development of monopoly capitalism. Actually, he was part of monopoly capitalism, so yeah, that's curious. Whether you are for or against it, but he was a capitalist. and came to believe in the ultimate colonization of the world by the English-speaking races. The consequence of this would be imperial federation. The apparent passing of the Māori he attributed to the effects of European colonization on a people ridden with the unclean spirit of practical communism. The alienation of their lands was inevitable. Evelyn Stokes' biography of Wiremu Tamahana, the man Firth claimed was his friend and the justification for his land dealings in the Matamata area, came along in 2002. Stokes used the past secondary and tertiary sources you see here on the screen and emphasised that while Tamahana did lease land to Firth, it is unlikely that it was an intention of his to sell that land and permanently alienate it from Ngāti Hawa and the other associated local iwi. Also useful in studying Firth and his world, there is online a 2016 paper on the battery at Wairongamai by Philip Hart of the Historical Research Unit in the University of Waikato. I found his research to be wonderful, fully sourced, fully footnoted, and he even went to the extreme of going into bank archives in the middle of Wellington. Love to know how he got hold of some of those. Despite his constant praise of private enterprise and private initiative, Hart wrote, Firth was very ready to seek financial assistance from government with some success. That his methods of obtaining land were seen as questionable was indicated by an 1875 statement by James Mackay, a land purchase officer, that Firth had offered him £100 to obtain a signature for a deed of sale from a Māori who would only deal with Mackay. In the same year, Charles Featherstone Mitchell claimed it was notorious that Firth had bought land for 6p or 8p an acre and resold it for £2 an acre. Hart also wrote that Firth claimed that he was a very liberal giver. No one was ever sent away hungry from my house. He estimated that he gave away £300 a year during the 1880s, nearly half the amount spent on his family's living expenses. But in a private letter, John Logan Campbell wondered about Firth's total self-centeredness, whether he was not altogether right in the head. I am always in fear that he will go off it. He is so peculiar and excitable and eaten up with infallibility of his own judgment. A National Bank inspector from Firth's final years spent trying to recover his tattered entrepreneurial reputation noted Firth was, quote, a shrewd, able and unscrupulous man of intensely sanguine disposition with no capital but his brains. The story begins with Josiah Firth's father, Benjamin. Benjamin Firth's life, as one source put it, was an eventful history. He was born around 1796 at Oakenshaw, today part of the city of Bradford in Yorkshire's West Riding, apparently into a well-to-do landowning family. He worked as a farm labourer from his youth to adulthood until an accident changed his life. A kick from a horse damaged his hip, making him unable to work the long hours in the fields and giving him a permanent limp. It appears he then took up work in a quote, this is one of the Google shots, what does it look like now? Well, pretty rural and bucolic. So I thought I'll add that onto the presentation. It appears that Benjamin then took up work in a quarry and there heard a sermon which set him on the course of lay ministry. This led to studies under the tuition of an independent or congregational minister at Cleckheaton into Latin, Greek, and mathematics, proving that he was a very good scholar. Benjamin Firth became known as the learned plebeian and started a series of religious-based tuition schools in the district, which culminated in his own private academy for boys at Manor House on Hartshead Moor at Clifton, with a roll at times numbering 150 pupils. A congregational church at Wyke was built in 1827, and Firth was the first minister there, although still not ordained. In January 1826, he married Mary Bateman, daughter of Daniel Bateman, owner of an ironworks at Low Moor, who imported wire from Sweden and turned it into carding for the booming woolen mills nearby. A year later, Josiah Firth was born, followed by his sister Sophia in 1829. but in 1833, their mother Mary Firth died. In 1842, Benjamin Firth entered the captain of industry phase of his life. He hadn't, though, left behind either his ministry or his academy. He bought the Victoria Mill at Brighouse, seen here much later in the century after a fire. I wish I could find a photograph of it before, but that was the best I could find. And engaged in the business of flax spinning with two partners. The partnership dissolved in 1845. He also invested in the new railway companies springing up at the time. The West Yorkshire Railway Company in 1844, and the Bradford, Manchester and Liverpool Direct Railway in 1845. Firth's name appears on the committee list for the Halifax and Bradford Fire and Life Insurance Company, also in 1845. But by then, his downfall had begun. Benjamin Firth's business expansion was fueled by borrowed money. The bank from where he borrowed his money, the Leeds and West Riding Banking Company, crashed into bankruptcy over the course of 1846 due to a run on railway company deposits. The bank was unable to honour its cheques, and its creditors came to the mortgagors, like Firth, for their money. At the time of the bank's failure, Firth owed the bank £5,000. His own resulting bankruptcy caused the sale of his 3 mills, warehouses, 4 houses at Scholes, coal fields, and other land, including a brickyard, in 1849. Benjamin never got over this, ever. For the remaining few years of his life, he stewed and fulminated against the banks, against all those he felt had taken his riches away from him, until one night in 1853, after enumerating his troubles yet again, he had a seizure which took his life at the age of 56. By 1851, after working for his grandfather, Daniel Bateman, in a counting house for a time, Josiah was a commercial traveller, living with his father at Manor House, while his sister Sophia worked there as a housekeeper. His father's death no doubt spurred him to leave and seek his fortune. In December 1854, Josiah obtained title to 2 allotments on Cook Street near Nelson Street in Auckland, brought former Manor House pupil William Brooke Smith into the partnership in 1855, then his cousin and another old pupil of Manor House, Daniel Bateman Thornton, by 1856. Firth's first enterprise was brickmaking on the Cook Street allotments, the business known as the Napier Brickworks. In his own words, how I cut down the Manuka, how I built a small cottage, how I engaged an old soldier and a rollicking Irishman, both old gold diggers, as my first workmen, how I built my brick kiln, how the water failed, how I digged a well, yes, he did say digged a well, which said, well, I am pleased to think, in all the dry seasons for 20 years and more, supplied water to scores of families in the now thickly peopled little valley. How I loaded the bricks into drays, my hands at first often skinned and bleeding in the process. How I made a road out of the deep gully. How I battled with a pair of restive horses up the steep hill. How my men struck. How I finally conquered these and 100 other difficulties will be of no particular interest to anybody. Suffice it to say that I often look at the scene of my early struggles with keen interest. After work was over, a quiet stroll on the beach was often rewarded by glimpses of Māori life and manners worth noting. Interesting thing, just as an aside, all this comes from his book Nation Making, which is available online through the ENZB. He described a fire around 1848 that, or the 1858, in the 1850s, sorry. He described a fire that took place, and I did find the record of this, in one of the storehouses that was storing kauri gum. And the fire took hold because it had the gum. settlers weren't quite sure what to do. Water they couldn't really get readily access to, even though it was by the bay. It was local Māori who got the idea to climb up on top and actually shovel soil down onto the fire itself, smothering it. And Firth noted that and he said, oh, that's clever, you know. And then in the next breath, he went on to say, I often thought it would have been better fellows as friends than as enemies. They appeared to me in these early days to be quite satisfied as to who were masters. They seemed to have quite settled it that we were good at everything except fighting. Curious speculations would occupy me during these evening strolls. I often drew fancy pictures of what would happen when these free and independent savages began to find out that we meant to be rulers of these islands, of what deeds would be done, of what struggles, massacres and terrors would be witnessed if we ever came to take opposite sides. A lot of this was 2020 hindsight. He was writing this in the 1890s, so long after the New Zealand Wars and everything else. But I gradually made up my mind, he said, but the trial of strength between the races would certainly come before long. In 1856, Firth, Smith and Thornton bought land on Queen Street and erected their first steam flour mill at a cost of £20,000. This would be destroyed by fire soon after, but the affluent partnership simply rebuilt in 1860. Firth dabbled briefly in the business of politics, elected to the House of Representatives in January 1861, only to change his mind and tender his resignation 16 months later. During the Waikato War, Firth was a volunteer with the local militia, and as such, he claimed to have taken part in raids on Māori settlements on the southern shore of the Manukau Harbour, and may even have taken part in the confiscation of Te Tokia Tapere, as you see here. The historic waka is presently on display at the Auckland War Memorial Museum. He wrote of the occasion of the raids with enthusiasm, despite the fact that the villages were inhabited only by women, children, and old men at the time. And it was even later found out that the tribes there were friendly, not hostile to the Crown. In June 1868, Firth and his family came to live in John Ogilvy's home on the northeastern slopes of Mongawhau. When Ogilvy ran into financial trouble, Firth bought the title outright and proceeded to add to his land holdings there, creating his Clifton, along with his crenellated tower, completed 1873, which has since lent the name to Castle Drive. For Clifton's tower and the other enlargements to Ogilvy's former home, Firth was, as Mona Gordon put it, his own architect and designer, with a fascination for Norman military architecture, even down to fittings reminiscent of those used to defend old-time battlements with boiling fluids. The tower itself, 4 square and of 4 stories, attaining a height of 50 feet, it gave the impression of far greater height than the reality, rising sheer from the yard and surmounted by a turret like a miniature replica of itself and battlemented also. The battlements, 5 to a side, not counting the large cornerwise one, were nicely proportioned and essentially Norman in style. On the outer edge of the corners were heads of rams, lions, and of Māori chiefs in pairs, those of the former having been cast over maculations. A cornice bearing a 6-fold design in low relief served as exterior decoration, the whole being supported by corbels, 7 to a side. The gardens there were lovingly described by his granddaughter in her books. It was Firth's gardens that formed the background to the garden party that stole the show when King Tawhio came to Auckland, and inches of newspaper columns thrust Firth firmly into the limelight in 1882. What is now Mountain Road was then known as Firth's Road through to the early part of the 20th century. In 1873, he donated a pine plantation atop the Monga, and around that time became involved with the Wastelands Board, which governed the Monga as Crown land. He furiously opposed the new Domain Board that was set up to administer the Monga, decrying the move to have those west of the slopes represented as well as those to the east. such as himself. And he resigned from his appointment to the Domain Board forthwith. And my tone when I say forthwith, yes, it was very much, I'm leaving now. A few years later, after another outburst of temper when he couldn't get his own way, he stormed away from the Wastelands Board altogether. That said, it is Firth and his determination that it is credited with the formation of the Summit Drive there at Mongawhau, which we know today. Part of his legacy was to make the Monga more accessible to the public. Of course, many felt at the time he also did this to ease access to his own land, but that is still something that can be debated. Firth from the 1870s through to the 1890s was keenly interested and, to a certain degree, involved with the rifle range next door to his Mount Eden Epsom home. In the 1850s, he had been a member of the Volunteer Rifles, so his interest in the military went back quite a way. When the rifle range was set up, he expressed no opposition to it, unlike his neighbours, and also made no complaints of stray shots going over the mark. Instead, he provided funding for competitions for rifle matches and other necessities, and was cheered regularly by the volunteers as they were on the range as he rode by on his horse. Firth's main claim to colonial fame, though, was his acquisition of his Matamata estate, estimated by some to have been 55,000 acres. I'd say that was still an understatement, but essentially Firth acquired the start of his holdings by striking up a friendship with Wiremu Tamahana of Ngāti Hawa, obtaining a lease from the well-known rangatira during the last 2 years of Tamahana's life. After Tamahana died in 1866, Firth began to convert his leaseholding to freeholding in his own name. Firth cemented his claim to be the one Tamahana wanted to hold the land by telling all within hearing of his great friendship with Tamahana and putting up a monument on which, and you can see that pictured, on which he had a plaque placed saying, "These were his last words. Let her hire, Josiah, remain in possession of his run." The monument, or at least the first one, was destroyed soon after Firth obtained the freehold of the land on which it stood in 1872 by person or persons unknown. There is another monument which is closer to the Firth Tower and the Matamata Museum, but that's not this one. Over a period of 2 decades, Firth added more land by converting leases into freehold via sittings at the Native Land Court held at Cambridge. Many of these transactions now known to be made at a disadvantage to mana whenua in the area. Land where Firth had a lease agreement couldn't be readily sold to another buyer. Well, they'd say, who has an interest in this land? Firth? He can't buy this land. You've got a lease with Firth. And if the Māori owners were reluctant to sell their property to Firth, he simply had the Native Land Court in Cambridge arrange a subdivision due to his interest in the land and to recoup the survey fees he paid for at the outset. This is the point. When the native landowners wanted to go through the whole, now that we know with 2020 hindsight, unfair process of the Native Land Court, they needed to have their land surveyed. They didn't have the money for the survey, but Firth did. Essentially, Firth was giving them a loan, and then he called in the loan. It probably helped that his agent at the Cambridge hearings was also his brother-in-law, William Williams. Those are just some of the areas that I got from titles. That's why I'm saying, I say the 55,000 acres is probably an understatement that he actually held. From 1883, Josiah Clifton Firth was in sole charge of the Queen Street Wharf, or known as the Wharf Mill, and down south he was known by some, not entirely without sarcasm, as the Duke of Matamata. At Matamata, Firth built his other tower. At a function in 1884, he said, "All through these native difficulties, I am grateful to be able to say that no hostile shot has been fired, or any blood of either race shed on the plains of Matamata. in order to give confidence to my workmen and their families. I subsequently erected a tower of concrete, which will enable me to hold the country against any of the hostile bands which used to prowl about. Thanks to the policy of the Honourable John Bryce, noted these days in connection with Parihaka. My fort is now only used substantial dwelling and to hoist on the flagstaff, as on this occasion, the grand old flag of England, serving also perhaps to remind all future settlers of the dangerous times through which we early colonists passed. His Matamata farm was, he'd said, intended to supply his flour mills at Auckland with wheat. Money from the loans he obtained was poured into the estate like water into the soil. He straightened parts of the Waikato River to ease navigation of the waterway and experimented with new types of bees to enhance honey production. As his biographer Waterson wrote, from telephones to windmills, beehives to a dairy factory, Matamata was a New Zealand showpiece of modern rural technology. But the soils there proved far too poor to be much competition for soils in the South Island and Australia and their grain production. And his intended planned and strategic subdivision for profit of his lands didn't work out due to delays in establishing a railway connection. Desperately, he subdivided part of his farm anyway in 1880, quietly offering pieces for sale in England. By 1884, the local press realised what was happening, so his quiet self-liquidation became public. By 1887, he could no longer meet his commitments for the mortgages or his Matamata estate, and an agreement was reached between his guarantor, the New Zealand Loan and Mercantile Agency, and the Bank of New Zealand. The estate was taken over and later passed on to the Bank of New Zealand Estates Company, which was in those days kiss of death, because they were the liquidators that worked for the Bank of New Zealand to get whatever money they could out of selling the properties. Meanwhile, in 1883, Firth opened up a new concrete granary in Albert Street here in Auckland, celebrating with a banquet for 150 people, his employees, the contractors, and other friends. The New Zealand Herald and the Star both sang his praises. The Observer newspaper, however, seemed to shift from day to day, report to report, as to how wonderful they thought Firth really was. Despite the loss of his Matamata estate, Firth seemed to go from strength to strength, though, at least as far as the public was concerned. In 1888, he built on land he leased from the Auckland Harbour Board his 8 hours mill and another grain store. Here, he claimed support of the workers' 8-hour day. There was 3 8-hour shifts, hence the name of the mill, and introduced American roller mill technology. The machinery he used came from a firm in Indianapolis. With, again, I've used this phrase often, but it is with 20/20 hindsight. The Observer later caricatured Firth's 1889 downfall in 1891, just 3 years after the wonderful opening of the 8 hours mill. Here we see Firth, the well-dressed businessman, backgrounded by his Matamata tower to one side and his memorial obelisk to Wiremu Tamahana to the other. He distributes coins from out of a bag to workers who are on one knee, both in gratitude and appeal. But the bag is marked as coming originally from the Bank of New Zealand, one of his 2 principal creditors. But then in April 1889, Firth's credit was curtailed. The 8-hour mill stopped and layoffs began. Later that year, Mr. Buckley laid out to the Bank of New Zealand directors that Firth owed them up to £25,000, amongst a list of other well-known businessmen at the time who were also in debt to the bank. That's Buckley, painting Firth's hands black with tar as the rest of Firth's clothes deteriorate the appearance of a tramp. Firth lost a £7,000 court case to the New Zealand Loan and Mercantile Agency and was declared bankrupt. But, as the Observer noted, it appeared that Firth was leniently treated by the official assignee. The tar whitewashed on his hands and his solicitors working hard to repair his reputation. Firth himself publicly blamed everyone and everything else for his downfall. Echoes of his father angrily denouncing banks and railway companies at a dinner table in Yorkshire 3 decades earlier. His Matamata estate gone, both of his mills and his new granary gone, all Firth seemed to have left was his Clifton home at Mount Eden. The reason why he still clung on to that was that in May 1888, finally acting with caution in his business affairs, he conveyed it to his wife, thus protecting the house and land, although his chattels did come up for valuation at the bankruptcy. But then on the 3rd of March 1891, the BNZ lodged a transfer of the mortgage on the land. Yes, even Clifton was used for Firth's funding, to the Bank of New Zealand Estates Company Limited. The Estates Company handled bad debts and liquefied assets, and the risk was now quite real that Clifton could be taken over if the mortgage repayments weren't met. At the time, Firth's fortunes were at near rock bottom. But on the 4th of March of that year, Firth wrote a letter to Major Forster Yelverton Goring at the Brigade Office in Auckland, a letter which has been lost, sadly, or mislaid in the archive files, but was referenced in a later 11th of March letter still on file. Firth advised Major Goring that it had become necessary, due to circumstances, to give notice on behalf of his wife, that the range had to close by the 1st of October 1891. The bank's actions meant they'd have to subdivide, you see, and thus there could be no rifle range because that could impact on sales. Yes, it would have been fun actually trying to sell the land while bullets were whizzing overhead. During this time, there was talk in the city that an injunction might shut the rifle range down. No one, though, said publicly who was behind that threat. Firth also travelled to Wellington, where undoubtedly he lobbied incessantly until those in power saw things his way. In December 1891, an agreement was reached between the military authorities and Firth for a £7,000 loan at 2.5% interest. A mortgage from the public trustee was registered in Annie Firth's title in June the following year. I've made inquiries at Land Information to try to see if I could find this document and whether it still exists in their records, but they were unable to find it. So all that can be said is, judging by the correspondence between Josiah Firth and the authorities, this looks like the solution to the problem faced by the Firths regarding their loan from the Bank of New Zealand. They simply paid off that loan with the public trust loan, and they knew that they would not have to pay the full money of the public trust loan off for 10 years. The Mount Eden property would remain intact until 1902, 10 years after the loan was lodged. On top of this, though, it appears that Anne Firth was paid £225 compensation per annum for 5 years from the government, and a high stone wall was agreed to be built by the government to protect Firth's grounds from spent bullets. This is Firth, who didn't mind the rifle range being right next door, but suddenly he had a problem with spent bullets and he wanted a wall. Thomas Thomson, the Minister of Defence from 1896 to 1900, described the payment to Anne Firth when asked about it in Parliament in 1897 as simply a rent paid to Mrs. J.C. Firth. So Firth was able to keep his home until he died. He did attempt to resurrect his entrepreneurial reputation with some patents and published papers, proposed projects funded by more borrowing, this time from the National Bank, for example. But for him, really, it was the end. When he died in 1897, there was no more flour, but he was still master of, at least, his Auckland Tower. Thank you for listening.